Hello folks, I'm Pamela Young. This is Thrive 2030, brought to you by Growth Curve, and I'm so delighted today to have as my guest Hugh Mackay, who is an Australian psychologist. He is one of our most renowned social researchers and writers of 23 books, and he has an enormous career, and I'd like to welcome him today. How are you, Hugh?
Thank you very much, Pamela. It's a great pleasure to see you and to be talking to you.
Thank you. Well, I am so delighted that you have made some time or have been able to give some time to the viewers here today, because I've known you for about a decade, maybe a little longer, and I've followed your progress, and we've had lots of meetings on our journey together, and I'd like to touch on that as we go through today's conversation. But let's first talk about you. You have had 5 or 6 decades of a great career, which has culminated in this wonderful feat of being able to say author of 23 books, but it started way back yonder when you were a fresh psychology graduate. Let's start way back there. You started off as a researcher and started writing some regular reports called the Mackay Report, and you're also a journalist doing weekly commentary for newspapers and so forth. Could you just talk us through the beginning of your career before you started writing all these books?
Yes. It's very inauspicious. I left school at 16, which was a bit young. My parents had made it very clear that I would need to go to work. There would be no such thing as the luxury of full-time university. So I got a job, age 16, as a clerk in a public opinion research company. This is 1955, when public opinion research was really in its infancy in Australia. And I got that job because my father heard about this company and heard they were looking for people and thought that it might suit young Hugh, which it did, because I'd always been a very curious-minded kid, always interested in observing and trying to understand what was going on, why people did the things they did. I remember as a kid spending hours and hours sitting in a tree near the house where I lived, just watching people going past and sort of observing this. And then when I got into this job, and we're talking primitive research, this is pre-computers, yes, pre-television, everything was done by hand, pencil and paper and so on. But I very soon realized that this could be a job, doing what I love doing, observing people and trying to figure out why people do what they do. So I became an evening student at Sydney University, studying initially economics, which my employer had said I needed to study, but I hated it, so I abandoned that, and then did an arts degree in psychology and philosophy. And again with social psychology, when I got deeply into that, I realized this was my passion, trying to make sense of why people behave in the way they do. So it was a lovely theoretical framework for the work that I was doing, even though a lot of the research projects I was working on were commercial. I mean, measuring media audiences or people's voting intentions or all sorts of things. I soon realized that it doesn't matter, even if you're figuring out what brand of breakfast cereal people prefer, it's something to do with the psychology of human beings, how we interact, how our tastes and preferences emerge, and how we express ourselves. So I was hooked from a very early age. I went from there to the audience research section of the ABC, worked there for 3 years studying the behaviour of radio and television audiences. Then I ran a commercial research division of an advertising agency for 8 years, and then I started my own business. And
how old were you when you started your own business, Hugh?
33.
Okay.
33. Okay. So that was in 1971, and then towards the end of my first, when I started my own business, I had an ambition to launch a social research program which would be funded by subscriptions from commercial organisations, advertising agencies, media groups, etc. Just studying not specific markets, but studying Australian social attitudes. And that's the thing that I called the Mackay Report, and it was launched in 1979. And it began very slowly with just a few companies being slightly puzzled by this whole idea, but paying up their modest subscription. And it gradually grew. At its peak, I had I never quite achieved 100 subscribers, but I did get 99 subscribers, and I ran that for 25 years. And that became really the main body of my research work. Four reports, sometimes 6, but always a minimum of 4 reports each year for those 25 years. And then I sold that project to another research company, and it fizzled out soon after. But those 25 years of running that project were really, that became my lifeblood, not just commercially, but intellectually as well. That was how I really got inside the Australian psyche. All those years I just spent sitting in people's living rooms or perched on a kitchen stool or the back veranda, listening to people tell their stories, whether the subject was politics or raising kids or, why you live, where you live, or every imaginable subject I covered over those 25 years. A lot of the most interesting studies were to do with positions in the life cycle, like I did one on turning 19 and another one on turning 40 and another one on retirement and so on. It was a source of endless fascination and satisfaction. And that ultimately led to my first book. So I didn't actually write a book until 1993. My first book was called Reinventing Australia. And that was like a summary of what all this research had been telling me over all these years. The publisher had come to me and said, look, you've been writing all these reports and all these newspaper columns and everything. Why don't you put it all into a book? So I did. And that book went very well. And that really encouraged me to go on writing and updating. The nicest thing that happened as a result of that book and subsequent books is people saying to me, oh, it sounds as if you were sitting in our kitchen, you're saying all the things we talk about. And I said, of course, that's because that's what I've been, that's my job, listening to people talking.
The subtitle of that book, Hugh, was The Mind and Mood of the Australian People in the 90s. What was the mind and the mood of the Australian people in mind?
It was a very agitated time. And I think that's one reason why it sold well and why people appreciated it, because Australia had been through some really major upheavals. I mean, the triple revolutions of gender, information technology and economic restructuring. We had record unemployment, the highest rate of unemployment since the Great Depression of the 1930s. A lot of people were destabilised and bewildered by the rate of social change. We had a new Family Law Act and a massive spike in the divorce rate. The birth rate was plummeting. Lots of things were changing quite radically in Australia. And as a result of that, anxiety levels were rising. We were beginning to understand depression as a major mental illness affecting a lot of people. We were starting to become more socially fragmented. That became a much more serious theme later. So that book was really an attempt to say to people, this is what's happening. These are the changes we're going through. These are the upheavals. This is nothing less than a redefinition of the Australian way of life. We are reinventing Australia, and no wonder we're feeling a bit destabilised, a bit bewildered and a bit uncertain. And so people, I think, appreciated. I mean, my clients had been reading all this research for years, but then when the general readers got onto it, I think they appreciated having some insight into why they felt as confused or anxious or bewildered as they did. The nicest thing anyone's ever said about my research, and it was said back then, was, "Oh, this bloke explains us to ourselves."
Well, Hugh, I have many of your books lying around coffee tables at my home and office, and people that come in always look at them and go, "Oh, he's a wonderful author. Doesn't he write so well? What's that one about?" You know, there's always a recognition of your books and your work. And you're right, you know, you do seem to get into the fabric of society, and people, they do recognise themselves in your stories. I recognise myself in some of your stories after many coffees that we've had together over the decade we've known one another. So after that great start to your career, which was a book about the Australian society as a whole, you then have written quite a number of books about specific topics like, you know, why don't people listen, and the right and the wrong, media mania, what makes us tick, the art of belonging. Each of those are different topics that are around a specific part of society. Which were the main couple that you think had the biggest impact on Australian people?
Well, the second book that I wrote was the one you just mentioned, called Why Don't People Listen?
Yes.
And that was a summary, because while I'd been doing all that research, I'd also been I'd built a little conference centre in the central west of New South Wales, and I was running regular short courses, workshops on the psychology of communication for business leaders, you know, corporate people, public servants, teachers, all sorts of people used to come to those little courses that I ran in an attempt to explain to people how communication really works. And after doing that for about 20 years, I thought, I've got to capture this in a book as well. So the first book was about the social research. The second book was about the other half of my career, which was communication psychology, and that had it didn't sell as well as Reinventing Australia, but it had a very good, strong response. Again, I think because it explained things to people that they hadn't previously understood about themselves and each other. Why do we, why do we so often feel that we're not getting through to other people? Why don't people listen to us? Why is it so hard to change people's minds? So I think that book was. I still occasionally come across people who have copies of that book and refer to it because it is full of stories. It takes the story of a family all the way through the book, illustrating how communication breakdowns and misunderstandings so easily occur, and what a powerful role our prejudices and preconceptions play in inhibiting our ability to listen to each other, because we're always filtering what we hear. So it becomes more comfortable. We misinterpret and mishear so that it becomes more comfortable for us. So but then after that, yes, I did broaden out into some other themes. I was always interested in moral philosophy and ethics, so I wrote that book called Right and Wrong. At the same time, I'd been involved in helping to establish an organisation that was originally called the St James Ethics Centre in Sydney. It's now been renamed just the Ethics Centre. That happened in the early 90s. So that was expressed in that book. And then the other books like The Good Life, The Art of Belonging, Beyond Belief and so on, they've all become slightly more reflective versions of the social analysis. So I'm not just in some other books I've written, like Australia Reimagined, which was a more recent book. I have come back to basic social analysis, but I've also tried to extend it a bit into slightly more philosophical reflections, like the Kindness Revolution.
Yes, you've done 3 major books about Australia culture: the Reinventing Australia in '93, Advance Australia Where in 2008. Most people are very familiar with that title, and then the more recent Australia Reimagined in 2018. From the journey from '93 to 2018, how have things changed, do you think? What have been the major things that you can say that you are proud to have identified about the Australian culture, and how it's overcome its challenges, and where is it now?
Yes. Well, it's been a story of, I mean, there have been some wonderful things and some disturbing things. It's been a story, I mean, I think the 2 spectacularly good things to be said about how Australia has evolved over this period is we have become a truly multi-ethnic, multicultural society in a way that early in my research career I would never have predicted, because I grew up in the early years of my working life. We were experiencing that huge surge of post-war migration, and we were a very prejudiced society. You know, refugees were called refos. It was you know, we just weren't ready for all of these strange people from different cultures, different religions, etc. And it looked for a long time as though we were going to be very divided by that. But really, the brilliant story, the most brilliant aspect, I think, well, one of the 2 most brilliant aspects of Australian society evolving has been that we have actually become probably the most harmonious, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural society on the planet. And I think that's a cause for great celebration. There was a lot of pain along the way, and it took a long time. That's really more or less resolved itself to the point where we don't even have to mention it. We now know that about ourselves. Similarly, I think there's been good news on the gender front. I mean, we still have a long way to go before we can claim that we've embraced true gender equality. But again, if I go back to the beginning of my research career, the early decades of my working life, that was a society in which, well, even women accepted that women were to be second-class citizens. The idea, I mean, women would be paid less than men for doing the same job was a principle. Why would women be paid less than men for doing the same job? Oh, because they're women. I mean, unbelievable today. And the fact that it's unbelievable today just demonstrates what a huge revolution that has been. We now think that's not just absurd, but kind of amusing. It's so crazy. And yet that was how it was. You know, a woman who had a job in the public service who married had to resign. You couldn't have a permanent job in the public service as a married woman. Permanent jobs were for breadwinners, and that could only be men or single women. So this is all, sounds as though it's the Dark Ages, but it's not that long ago. So that's a huge, still further to go, but I think that gender revolution, which really started to gather momentum in the 70s, but really developed through the 80s and 90s, like multiculturalism, has been our great success story. But on the downside, Pamela, I think
just before we go to the downside, can I just challenge you on the gender topic? I mean, when you look at the United Kingdom, for example, you know, they've had Margaret Thatcher, who was, you know, a very early female prime minister. I think she had 3 terms. Is that correct? 3 terms. And of course, now, you know, you've got Prime Minister Sunak, who is, you know, a ethnic minority, from an ethnic minority and religious minority, and you know, they've embraced him and put him into that lead role. I think Australia is a long way from that. We've had a female prime minister for a year or 2. I don't know that Julia Gillard even completed her first term. Do you think that on a comparable basis that Australia really is that advanced in both cultural and gender diversity?
No, I think culturally we have moved a long way, but it hasn't yet filtered through to leadership in general, not just political leadership, but leadership in general. I mean, there are many now outstanding women in leadership roles in Australia, but we're still at the stage in Australia where people say, oh, this is the first female president of a Aussie Rules football club, or this
Yeah.
is the first female governor of the Reserve Bank. And we still have to mention it because it's still, we've been so slow to get there that it's still regarded as remarkable.
Mm.
And we haven't yet got to the stage where we just say the new governor of the Reserve Bank is Michelle Bullock. We don't bother to mention the first woman. So we are lagging on that, but we're getting there. And I think, I think even in our federal parliament, at least on the Labor Party, the current government, it's about a 50-50 male-female representation. So it's gradually happening in leadership. But and there's still more ground to be covered in the culture. There's still a male backlash. There are still misogynists out there who are still trying to resist the revolution or having trouble coping with it. But nevertheless, compared with our history,
work in progress.
Yes.
Are there any other major cultural changes other than those two, gender, cultural diversity, in terms of the acceptance of what's going on in the world, or, how we respond to changes in the world from
Yes, I think Australia is much more outward looking than it was. I mean, people used to say Sydney is the international city, and everywhere else is very parochial. I don't think you'd say that anymore. We're much more conscious, partly because of the media revolution. We're partly more, we're far more conscious of what's going on in our region and around the world. And that, of course, doesn't increase our happiness index. We're absorbing the world's bad news every day, but we do feel, and I think some of our political leaders have very correctly edged us towards understanding that we are part of a much greater whole, whether we're talking politically, culturally, or economically. We can't think of ourselves as isolated in the way that we used to enjoy thinking of ourselves. I mean, Australia used to love the idea that we were so far from everywhere else. Well, we're not so far anymore.
No, the planes are bigger and they go faster. In the most recent book, the Australia Reimagined, I think the subtitle was something like towards a more compassionate and less anxious society.
Yes.
What do you mean by less anxious?
Yes. Well, that brings us to the other major change, which is negative. And that is that we have become, as a result of a whole series of social trends, particularly over the last 30 years, some a bit longer than that, but let's say that mainly the last 30 years, we've become a much more socially fragmented society. I think it's important, just as a frame for making this point, Pamela, that we've got to remember we're humans, and humans belong to a social species. It's absolutely in our DNA to cooperate, to congregate, to connect, to communicate. That's who we are. We are built we exist in a kind of a shimmering, vibrating web of interconnectedness and interdependence. And if we try to deny that we are all strands in that web, we get into all sorts of trouble, and a lot of mental illness is associated with trying to pretend that we're not part of the web, or feeling as if we're not part of the web. So that's who we are. And yet, over the last 30 or 40 years, so many of the decisions we've been making about how to live have driven social trends that have taken us away from our true nature as communitarians. We're a cooperative species. The neuroscientists say they can find the cooperative center in the human brain. That's who we are. And yet, now more of us are living alone, 25% of Australian households contain just one person.
Yes.
But we've never had a society like that before.
Mm-hmm.
We have a high rate of relationship breakdown. We have a high level of mobility. We're moving house on average once every 6 years. We're all frantically busy. Busyness, the great enemy of social cohesion. You know, the neighbours are having drinks on Friday night. Sorry, too busy. Don't disturb mum, she's busy.
Yes.
Busyness has become a kind of social disease. We're more mobile also in the sense we have universal car ownership. We do most of us live in drive-in, drive-out suburbs where footpath traffic has reduced enormously. I was talking to a young woman recently who just moved into a new housing subdivision in Orange in the central west of New South Wales, who said she hasn't yet met her neighbours. They're all in these new houses. They've all got electric garage doors. They drive up goes the door. They drive in, down goes the door. That's it.
Yes.
She said she expects she'll run into one of her neighbours when they're putting the garbage out one night. But all of that is antisocial.
Yes.
Yet we've chosen to live in those ways. Plus, of course, the impact of information technology, which promises to connect us like never before, but actually makes it easier than ever before to stay apart from each other and to rely on screen-based contact. So I won't go on about all that, but just putting all those factors together, we have become less socially cohesive.
Yes.
The number one public health issue in Australia today is no longer obesity.
Mm-hmm.
The number one public health issue in Australia today is social isolation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a health issue because when people are socially isolated, they're at greater risk of loneliness, which we now recognise as a disease, anxiety, depression, inflammation, hypertension, sleep disorders, vulnerability to addiction, even reduced life expectancy. Now, this is not a uniquely Australian problem. It's a Western problem, but we have that problem in Australia. And that's the most disturbing of the long-term trends, this trend towards, of course, as we become more socially fragmented, as more and more people feel, I mean, just to put a figure on, the latest research shows us 32% of Australian adults, 32%, report feeling lonely most of the time.
Ooh, that is huge. That's a
The
third.
loneliest age group in our society is the 18 to 25-year-olds who 38% report feeling lonely most of the time, even though they're more connected than any generation in history. But they're connected, that's another subject, they're connected via screens at the expense of face-to-face, person-to-person eye contact, which is so fundamental to our mental health as members of social beings, of a social species. So all of that promotes individualism.
Yes.
And that's one of the social diseases of the present, that we've become a more individualistic, me-centered society. And that's not a healthy way for members of the social species to live.
Yes. Do you see, presumably that statistic is in the last few years,
Yes.
around COVID. Do you feel that there's an understanding by leaders in society and business and politics to do something about this? And if yes, what are we doing about it? What actions are being taken to address it?
Yes.
Are we in action yet, I guess is the question.
Well, I think it's not much political action. I think there's a lot of local action being taken. I think a lot of people are rediscovering. I mean, the neighbourhood has suffered as a sort of social setting during these past 30 years. But even in our biggest cities, people saying, "Oh, we don't know our neighbours," as though that doesn't matter. We've got family, we've got friends, we've got work colleagues. Well, humans live in neighbourhoods, and we have to remember that these people are our neighbours. We don't have to like them. We don't have to agree with them, but they're our neighbours and we need to behave in a neighbourly way.
Mhm.
I think we rediscovered that during COVID. A lot of people reconnected with their neighbourhoods.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of business leaders, managers of organisations, have begun to understand just how important to the mental health and therefore to the productivity of their organisations it is for people to feel as if they belong.
Yes.
To feel as if they are connected. And that was jeopardised, of course, during the years of lockdowns and people working from home. And even now, people thinking it's convenient to work from home and maybe I'll just continue to work from home. It's vital that we understand, even if it's not every day of the week, that we need to get back into the workplace with colleagues and people we can chat to and interact with and make eye contact with, because that's such a crucial ingredient of mental health. And I think a lot of corporate leaders have understood this. I think there's some very enlightened talk going on. I've worked very recently with a couple of organisations who are really interested in bringing their people back, letting them work from home sometimes, but bringing them back and devoting more time to building up the sense of collegiality, building up the community of the workplace so that people are reintegrated and so that that problem of social isolation, we begin to work on it in the workplace.
I think you're right, Hugh. I have heard from the chief executives that I interview on this series that throughout COVID, they became very aware of the need to connect with their people, not just because they needed to communicate messages about the business, where it was going, what it was doing, but they really started to understand the psychological impact of the changes in the world, particularly COVID, working from home, not being able to see your colleagues. And it has pushed them to think through really what their culture is and how do they build a culture that enables them to work in this hybrid way and for it to be effective. And I think people are still working through that. It's such a big challenge, how to adjust your corporate culture to be as successful as it might have been when everybody was in the office and you could get them all into the conference room and stand on the stage and do, a big presentation and have lots of hugging and face-to-face. When you don't have that, you've got to find other ways to connect with people emotionally.
Yes, and I heard something that pleased me greatly just yesterday about an organisation that used to give performance awards to individuals for particular performance. They've dropped all that. They're now giving team performance awards. So individuals can't be given a performance award. It has to be a group. It has to be the work of a team, not the work of an individual. And that's a very important recognition of the fact that that's how humans thrive.
Yes. What do you think has been the most, the thing that surprised you most during your journey and the thing that might have disappointed you most in terms of your observations of humans and the way people operate?
Yeah, well, a lot of things have surprised me. I mean, one of the things I've learned as a social researcher is don't predict too much because you can't tell. If I tried to predict what was happening now with artificial intelligence and the whole IT revolution 10 years ago, I would have been way off. Couldn't have imagined just how radical this change would be. I think a very pleasing thing has been to see how well Australians did respond to COVID. That we did go back to our nature as humans. We did understand we had to make sacrifices for the common good. We had to be more attentive to the needs of neighbours and so on. Disappointing, though, that now that the COVID threat has receded somewhat, still there, of course, but receded, people are they're saying, oh yeah, let's go back to normal, where normal wasn't necessarily a very good place to be. Normal was where we were suffering these epidemics of loneliness, anxiety, depression, where we were becoming more socially fragmented, neglecting our neighbour. Let's not go back to that. Let's remember the lessons that COVID taught us about the need to look out for each other, the need to make personal sacrifices for the common good. Let's hang on to those very human lessons that nature occasionally hands us through pandemics or bushfires or floods or other things that remind us of how to be human. I think a couple of other things that have surprised me are the dramatic decline of religion. Again, it's a Western phenomenon, not just Australia. I think the speed of that has surprised me, given the many benefits for society of religious faith and practice, whatever your particular religious beliefs might be, it doesn't matter. But the evidence is very strong that people who have some kind of religious faith and belong to a faith community have all kinds of health benefits.
Absolutely.
So did joy. So that's in decline, and that's been a significant contributor, I think, to the rise of the me culture and to fragmentation as well.
Yes, I think you're right. It is a shame because religious groups do have gatherings. They're usually more family oriented, aren't they?
Yes, we haven't worked out a substitute for that yet.
No, we need a modern version of it. That's less religious for those who find that too challenging and more spiritual, perhaps. But I think one of the things, as I sort of look through your career and, this enormous volume of 23 books, I think 14 or 15 of them are fiction books around social issues. And then you've got a bunch of 7 other books that or 9 books, which are fiction books. But when I look at the topics that you choose for non-fiction, I sometimes wonder, now what stimulated you to write about that topic? And with regard to your latest book, The Kindness Revolution, I wondered whether that might have been inspired by Jacinda Ardern's emphasis on showing kindness as a young Prime Minister.
Well, I was working on it before I became conscious of that, but she was a wonderful example of a national leader who's prepared to put kindness on the agenda. And I really wrote it because I became conscious of the fact that the missing ingredient in a lot of that contributed to a lot of the things that have been going wrong for us socially and culturally, the missing ingredient has been kindness, which I think of as almost an innate quality. I mean, again, when neuroscientists say there's a cooperative center in the human brain, they're saying we are born to cooperate, which means we're born with the capacity for all those qualities we need to cooperate. We're born with the capacity for kindness, for compassion, for showing respect towards other people, even people we don't agree with or like. I think one of the wonderful things about this species we belong to is that we do have the capacity to show kindness towards total strangers. People. Samuel Johnson wrote 250 years ago, kindness is in our power even when fondness is not. And I think we should stick.
Beautiful quote.
It's a great quote. Yeah. And that's kindness. It is like it's like the magic ingredient in a properly functioning society. When we come to realize that it's not some weird thing that we can turn on for special occasions, but for humans built to cooperate, it should be as natural as breathing. The human organism can't flourish without inhaling and exhaling breath. The human spirit can't flourish without the giving and receiving of kindness. And I think of kindness as, in some ways, the response to our deepest human need, which is to be taken seriously. In that book, What Makes Us Tick, where I talked about the 10 desires that drive us, number 1 on the list was the desire to be taken seriously. If you're a social animal, your deepest need is to belong, to be acknowledged, recognised, appreciated, included, taken, heard, taken seriously. So I define kindness as anything we do that shows another person that we take them seriously, that we've noticed them. I think of the original word, that lovely old-fashioned word, loving kindness. That's the original word. We've chopped it down to kindness. But loving kindness reminds us that kindness is an expression of human love, but it's a unique expression. I mean, when we talk about love, we're normally talking about affection. We're normally talking about the emotions. I love this person, or I love that movie, or I love my kids, or I love dogs or chocolate, or so. We're talking about emotions. But here's kindness, this unique form of human love which does not involve the emotions at all. It's just humans being human. It is natural for a social species to show kindness towards each other, even when we don't like someone, even when we don't. I mean, we should celebrate this every morning when we get out of bed. I belong to a species capable of showing kindness to strangers, to people I could never agree with. We can disagree kindly. We can terminate a relationship kindly. We can discipline a child kindly. We need to recognise this as a way of being in the world which will transform the world as well as transforming us.
Yes. You talk in the book about social fragmentation, and I'm wondering, where did that concept come from when you're interviewing people and in your research to write these books, when you're sitting in their kitchens and at bus stops and train stations where you go to connect with people? How did you arrive at this philosophy about?
Well, I mean, it comes out in people's expressions of how lonely they feel, or how, I remember one person talking about he lived in a terrace house in a suburb of Sydney. So he goes to bed every night, puts his head on the pillow, and he knows that on the other side of that wall, someone else is putting their head on their pillow, and he's never met them. They see each other occasionally, they've never spoken. Next door neighbour in a terrace house. And stories like that multiplied hundreds of times, indicating that we'd reached a point where well, I mentioned this earlier in the conversation, but that sense of our obligation to each other as neighbours has just been eroded, with very negative consequences for us for having lost that sense of. I mean, there was some research published a few years ago showing about 50% of Australians said they felt they couldn't trust their neighbour to call on in an emergency. Well, during COVID, we found we could call on our neighbours in an emergency. And when there are bushfires or floods, of course we can call on our neighbours. What that was really saying was we don't know our neighbours well enough to know that we can trust them to call on in an emergency. So I think that's those sort of signals were very, very powerful. And I could see that something was going drastically wrong here. At the same time, at the level of government and politics, there was the evidence that we were talking more and more about the economy. And here's something where Jacinda Ardern had something to teach us as well. But we've been talking more and more about the economy and less about society, as though it was just all about economics, not about citizenship or culture or friendship or neighbourliness or any of that sort of stuff. And I think that has had a terrible effect on our culture, leading us to think that, well, Australia's a prosperous society. Look how well we're all doing. We should all be feeling happy. We're so prosperous. Well, while all that's happening, 3.3 million Australians are living below the poverty line. The gulf between wealth and poverty in Australia is widening. there is huge disadvantage in our midst. But we're all supposed to say, well, look, the economic signs are all positive and the future is rosy, etc. That overlooks what this is all about, which is the health of the society. The health of the economy is there to serve a healthy society and to promote a healthy society. So that was another thing that worried me, that kindness had kind of gone off the agenda, whether we're talking about the growing gulf between the performance of private and public schools, or the way we're treating our elderly in aged care facilities, or how we've been treating asylum seekers, or how we've been responding to the needs of our First Nations people. Kindness never gets a mention. We don't say, well, the criterion, the first thing to think about is, how can we be kind? How can we be kinder in our policy development, whether it's social policy or financial policy, whatever? Let's think about, is it kind? Is it fair? And then let's talk about all the other criteria. But it's sort of gone off the agenda. And I thought it was very important to bring it back onto the agenda, make it a thing we talk about. That kindness is part of being fully human.
That social fragmentation, that concept, it's concerning, I think, for parents of teenagers. And you know, it seems people talk about the epidemic of social anxiety that teenagers and young 20s are feeling.
Yes.
And there's so much conversation amongst parents and managers of people, you know, who are in that sort of age group, about how do we help these young people address this anxiety that they feel. And they talk about it as being an epidemic because they've all got a doctor, a psychologist, many of them are on medication, they've all got a diagnosis, and there seems to be a greater acceptance that, you know, anyone between the ages of 12 and 25 might be needing some help in mental health, and it is a reality. And as a parent and as a business leader or a business owner, you know, we have to start thinking about what do we need to change to address that so it doesn't get passed down to the next generation as learned behaviour, because younger children can see that and they might take it on board, and it might be a behaviour that's learned, and then it perpetuates into the next generation. Do you think that we're at risk of that?
Yes, there are a lot of factors involved in this, but I have no doubt about the key factor, and the key factor is information technology, that there's been such a trade-off of face-to-face, person-to-person, eye contact, togetherness in favour of screen-based contact. And we haven't understood, I mean, it feels to kids as though it's all the same, you know, oh, there's my mate on the screen, or even someone I don't know on the screen, I'm talking to them like I'm talking to you now. I'm looking straight into your eyes on the screen, but of course, when you look at my image, it doesn't look as if I'm looking into you, and of course I'm not looking into you, I'm looking at a screen. There's a clinical psychologist in Melbourne, a woman called Dr. Michelle Lim, who has coined the term social hunger. And social hunger refers to a lack of daily, face-to-face, person-to-person, eye contact-based interaction. Neuroscientists now tell us the absolutely crucial ingredient in human connection is eye contact. I mean, if you doubt it, just remember how you feel if you try to have a conversation with someone who refuses to make eye contact with you. It's deeply disturbing. Well, on a screen, you never make eye contact. And what Michelle Lim has been saying is the symptoms of social hunger are very much like the symptoms of physical hunger. If we don't eat enough during the day, we get irritable, cranky. We always feel a bit more mellow after lunch than we do before lunch. Kids talk about being hangry. And one of the reasons why there's so much abuse and bullying and trolling and antisocial behaviour on social media is that the heaviest users of social media are socially hungry.
Yes.
That's one of the reasons why I said earlier that 18 to 25 age group, they're the loneliest generation in our loneliest age group in our society at the moment, even though they're the most connected. So we've got to really grab this problem by the throat. We've got to say, okay, we've let this get out of hand. We've allowed our kids to think that communicating via a device is the same as face-to-face. No, it isn't. We've got to have times when the devices are put away. In our organisations, we've got to spend, make sure that people are not spending all day in front of a screen. One of the problems about people spending all day in front of a screen, apart from social hunger, is that one employer just feels the same as another. Loyalty to an organisation is much lower among employees whose days are screen-based than among employees who are able to socialise and mix and attend meetings and all that sort of stuff. So we've I think now got to understand, yes, the horse has bolted, but we've got to chase the horse and rein it in, because this is a huge problem for human beings who are giving up too much of our humanity. And this is the problem for adolescents. If they're spending too much time with a device, someone I was talking to earlier today was describing two kids sitting together on a bench somewhere, both on their mobile phones.
Yes, instead of playing or running around the park together, or taking a swing or a swim.
I remember in a class of high school students that I was talking to recently, I said, how many of you sleep with your mobile phone under the pillow? A lot of hands went up. And then I said, well, how many of you check your phone last thing before you go to sleep and first thing when you wake up? Universal. Everyone's hand went up. They have become dependent, the fear of missing out, all that stuff. We know, and they're cleverly designed devices and cleverly designed platforms to create addiction. That's what they're really good at. The most sophisticated industry in human history, the information technology industry. So that's something we've got to accept. We want it. We want to use it. It's brilliant. It's convenient, but we've got to remember to compensate.
Yes. So the social impact is very evident. The economic impact, I don't think, has been weighed up yet, because that group 18 to 25 are struggling, to reach out into society. They are therefore, some of them behind in their learning or completing studies and getting their first jobs underway. That means that they are late in earning a bank balance that's going to help them get on the house slab, all these things. So there is an economic impact in terms of their contribution to productivity in the workforce, as well as, their earning power. So I'm wondering whether it's time for governments to step up. And, once upon a time, they put a lot of money into the slip-slop campaign, slip-slop-slack campaign, to try and encourage people to wear hats and cover themselves up and wear sunscreen, because, the skin cancer was an epidemic for portions. So do you think there's a need now for governments to step up and say, we need to embrace this group? Because it's a 10-year, it's a bit broader than that, isn't it? I think it starts in early teens, when they get to school and they're starting to feel stress and pressure for competition, for performance at school. The anxiety seems to kick in at 13, 14, 15 and can run on to 25 or 28. So, I do think that there is possibly a need for a conversation around how do we turn this around.
And I think that's happening, Pamela. A lot of schools are now banning electronic devices. Schools talking about we're going to go back to pen and paper examinations and book-based learning and so on. You can't turn the clock back entirely, but I think we've got to. The US Surgeon General recently, and just in the last few weeks, announced that 13 was far too young for a child to be given a mobile phone. That'll come as news to hundreds of thousands of Australian parents who've given their kids mobile phones at a younger age than 13. But
Oh, definitely.
adolescent health researchers have been saying now for at least a decade, no one under the age of 14 should be allowed to spend too much time on a screen-based device, partly because of unknown impact on the development of the brain.
Yes.
But also the very point you made earlier about social anxiety. The more time we spend not socialising directly and practicing our social skills in favour of our screen skills, the more we'll suffer because we're human. You know, if we were a different kind of species, it wouldn't matter. But we're this kind of species.
In your book, Hugh, you talk about the lucky country becoming the loving country. What do you think of the chances of that?
Well, I'm an optimist. I think there's a chance because we have to define what loving means. That sounds a bit soppy, doesn't it? But it's in the sense that I was talking about loving kindness and kindness as the unemotional expression of human love. That's what I have in mind. That we could become a country in which we've installed kindness as a characteristic that we admire. We want to encourage it in our children, we want to encourage it in our neighbourhoods, in our schools, in our workplaces, and in our political agenda. It could transform everything if we said, why, I mean, we were originally called the lucky country by Donald Horne back in 1964, whenever he wrote that book. And of course, he meant that as an insult. He was saying Australia's got more by good luck than good management. It was an attack on Australia's leadership. The lucky country. We, of course, chose to accept it as a compliment, as though he was saying something nice about us, but he wasn't. But we've sort of fallen for the idea, oh, we'll get by, we're a lucky country. Well, I think it would make much more sense to say, how about we become the loving country? How about we say kindness is going to be the defining characteristic of Australian society. Kindness and fairness. Not inconceivable. I don't think any of our current political leaders would be brave enough to stand up and say that. Although in the context of the Voice referendum, a few comments like that have been made. But it's not as though we're talking about let's do something radical. All we're talking about is let's get back to the essence of what it means to be human.
And what it is to be human is, as you say, if you go back to the 40s and 50s and 60s, before technology came on board, and we, only had a black and white TV and, a transistor radio, and we all sat around in big family groups. I often tell the story how I remember, very funny, in those days, everybody smoked. And of course, if somebody came to the house and there was already a dozen or so of us in the house, and then you add a few visitors, someone would stand up with a packet of cigarettes and very generously offer it around. By the time they'd done the whole group, they had an empty packet. And I don't know why that sticks with me as being something quite comical, but it does, because today smoking is so not acceptable. And, the last thing you would do is share your packet with anybody. Because that's so
yes. That's right.
So the way we behave is really different. And as you say, there is so much that's positive about, the opportunities today, especially when you look at AI and, the benefits that have come out of COVID. We are so much more advanced in technology, all of us, because we all had to learn new skills and step up to being able to communicate digitally and so forth. So there's been a huge number of positive outcomes, but I think there's a huge challenge.
Oh, we just have to resist the addiction. Yes.
Resist the addiction, absolutely. And learn to be brave about saying, I'm going to turn it off and I'm not going to touch it until after I've had my shower and my breakfast, and then after, a half an hour of me time, I will turn on my computer.
Yes.
So what's next, Hugh? Have you got some more books on the horizon?
Yes, I do. There's a non-fiction book coming out next May, which is like a bookend, reinventing Australia. As you said, the subtitle was "The Mind and Mood of Australia in the '90s." I have a book coming out in May called "The Way We Are," which will canvass some of these issues, but some others. and the subtitle is The Heart and Soul of Australia in the 2020s.
Ah, very nice.
So that'll be out in about 6 months.
Right, so that's kind of like a bookend to the journey of your
Yes.
research in Australia. Well, we look forward to that very much. Look, it's been a real delight having this opportunity to talk with you and share your story with viewers of Thrive 2030, because, as I said, I've known you for a decade or so. I remember coming to a book launch and I had bought a copy of the book before you gave your speech, and you signed it for me, and I didn't know you then. Listened to your talk, and while I was listening to you talk, I was thinking about my plans to write a book about the Australian business culture,
Yes.
which I subsequently did, called Stepping Up, as you know.
Yes.
But I don't know if you remember this, but at the end of your speech on that particular day, I got back into the signing queue, even though you'd already signed my book, because I wanted your phone number, because I wanted to talk with you about the thesis for my book. And I came back up to you and said,
yes,
I've already signed my book, but would you mind very much if we had a coffee? Because I'd love to tell you about the thesis for my book. And
yes,
would you just give me some reflections on whether you think that's a worthwhile story? And inside that book, under your signature, I've got your phone number and your email. And as a consequence of that, we had quite a few coffees over that next year as I was doing my research and writing my book. And I was always been so grateful to you for the the encouragement and support that you gave me through that 12 to 18 months that I did to research and find my way to putting that book together. So
well, I'm a great admirer of what you've done in those intervening years, Pamela, and it's been a very great pleasure to get to know you.
And you too, Hugh, and I'm looking forward to your next book. Wish you all the best with your ongoing journey, and just want to say a huge thank you for sharing your story with everybody today. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you.